You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Batuta Advocate on Desert Rock FM. Well, welcome back to the Batuta Advocate radio show, week 3 in isolation, recording from our respective Budgy Smuggler bedrooms. You're joined by myself, Clancy Overall, and of course, Errol Parker, editor-at-large. And this week, we're going back into this topic that you may have seen in the news cycle, which is the global pandemic of COVID-19. A couple of weeks ago, we were joined by Dr. Norman Suan, Daddy Suan, as some people know him as, and we kind of talked about the early stages of policy and measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This week, we are talking to Dr. Dan Suan, who's a researcher at the Garvan Institute and is an immunologist. You may have seen him on ABC News in recent weeks on the 7:30 report. Dan's here to talk to us about what the next few months are going to look like and how Australia is looking in general. Thank you for joining us, Dan. How are you?
Yeah, really good, thank you. Nice to be with you.
Now, how would you best describe what an immunologist is to the everyday punter?
Yeah, so it's an interesting specialty because it doesn't exist in many countries around the world. And it was really the foresight of a couple of pioneers in the field here in Australia, Ron Penny and Tony Batson, who took the view that the immune system is the root cause of a lot of medical problems, things like autoimmune diseases, really common things like allergies. And so a lot of the specialties in Australia are based on an organ, like you might be a heart specialist or a brain specialist. But all the way back then, 60 years ago, you couldn't really see the immune system. It's kind of like this nebulous thing that floats around in your blood, does a whole lot of different things. And so they foresaw that the immune system was something that needed to be its own specialty, so that you could study sort of underlying disease-causing processes in one field. So they put a field together, and so my job, I've got a few different jobs. I've got 3 different jobs. So I see patients with different immune disorders, different types of immunological problems. I work in the laboratory where we do people's tests, do people's immune tests, and then I do research into the genetics of immune diseases too.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about how you would, for one, how you found yourself in this particular job? It sounds like something you don't aspire to as a 10-year-old, you know, when everyone else is talking about astronauts and fire engines. Was there a path you kind of became aware of in your study and went down?
Yeah, so we're really lucky in Australia that most of our large teaching hospitals have an immunology unit. Mm-hmm. And so when you're sort of a junior doctor rotating through different terms, people sort of want to try a little bit of everything, try before you buy. So you did a bit of emergency medicine, a bit of psychiatry, a bit of surgery. And I was lucky enough to do a couple of immunology terms. So yeah, just got to see how interesting the field was. We have a really great array of different types of diseases that we look after. They tend to be really weird and rare diseases. So yeah, that's what sort of sparked my interest when I was a youngster. And like I said, we have a great tradition here in Australia of people in immunology. And so that's how I got into that.
As an immunologist, how have the past couple of months been for you? Like, have they been off the charts busy, or is this really what you've been training for, really?
So it's mainly been my colleagues, my amazing colleagues in microbiology, the people who study viruses, that they've obviously had to totally step up. For example, to make a test for this new virus, people work round the clock. People have no idea how much work went in January and February to make a test as quickly as possible to be available here in Australia. And then the epidemiologists and the public health units. So when there's a start of a pandemic like this is a really viral problem. And so they're the ones that really need to step up and they're the ones that really did all the work that got Australia to the point where, our curve was really behind those other countries, America and Europe. We did such a great job, or they did such a great job of protecting our borders from viral cases coming into the country. And that's the reason why we're in the position we're in now, because of their great work in January and February. I've had much less to do with it from that point of view. I've been part of the hospital's preparations, obviously. So it's a little bit different.
Now, you've gone viral with a couple of posts online talking about the pandemic, the outbreak in Australia specifically. And in fact, you were one of the first kind of encounters I had with the term flatten the curve. How would you say Australia has done and is doing from when you first kind of popped your head up, which, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you came across as a little bit alarmed about a month ago?
Yeah, so that's true. So to answer your best question, I think Australia has done a remarkable job. We've seen all of the measures put in by the government, closing the borders, things like that. But really, that second phase was the community's response to this problem. And it's the community that has to understand what the problem is, which is, a very contagious virus, and what to do about it, and then be prepared to go into their homes and stay there and adopt some very unusual practices. Not touching each other, washing your hands, those things are very unusual for our day-to-day lives. So the curve is very, very flat. So we've seen the number of cases fall. It's now hit a plateau again. So we're seeing about the same number of cases, new cases every day. And so we've done an incredible job to prevent that first surge that everybody was concerned about. When we talked about the risk that we could have an outbreak that looked like Spain or Italy here, it's chicken and egg stuff, because if you don't do anything, if we just continue to live life exactly the way we did everything in our everyday lives, then it's possible that this virus could have caused an outbreak that looks like Italy and Spain. It's possible. But it's only through people's actions, everybody, the community in particular, that we've managed to prevent that. So our curve is very flat. So that's bought us an incredible amount of time to prepare the hospital system for when there is an increase in cases. And so, I think the country's done incredibly well.
With the flattened curve, the expectation, I guess, is that there will be a spike again?
So a completely flat curve would be 0 cases. New cases per day, right? So that really means that you've got it completely, right? So that's not what's going on. So there is still very low levels of community transmission going on in the community. So that's why we're seeing new cases every day. And that is the thing that concerns everybody. And I guess the way to put it is that you still see the government planning to increase the number of intensive care beds. So if everything was perfectly fine, they wouldn't be doing that, right? Yeah. So what that tells you is that there's still going to be an increase in cases to the point that the hospitals will need to be treating a lot of COVID-19 patients. Yep. But the whole point of our action 6 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago is that it lowers the height of the surge and it delays it, pushes it back in time to give the hospital system time and space to prepare and cope.
Have you seen anything quite this contagious in your work before?
So that's a really interesting question. When I was a medical student, measles was a disease of textbooks. We didn't see any cases clinically because we had such great vaccination rates. And so as a medical student, I just thought that this was one of those diseases that had been consigned to history. And so it wasn't until 2008, about maybe 10, 12 years ago, that I saw my first case of measles. And what people don't realize is that measles is way more contagious than COVID-19, than SARS-CoV-2. So it just goes to show you that if you drop vaccination rates, and we've had a big surge in the anti-vaccine movement in the last 10 to 15 years, which is one thing that immunologists definitely battle against. If we drop, drop vaccination,
that's your enemy. That is your
exactly.
number one
well,
enemy.
They're not our enemy. They're people with a view, and we need to continue to talk to them respectfully and earn back their trust. Right? It's actually very important that we don't. Belittle people too much because then you just push them away. So now people see measles in the emergency department. Sick children, horrendous rash, fever, and all the complications of measles. We've had people die of measles. Measles is a deadly disease, and so we're seeing small cases of that. But it just goes to show you what happens when we drop vaccination rates. Otherwise, look, we had a couple of previous pandemics. We've had swine flu, things like that. And the closest two viruses to this virus, things like SARS, obviously, and MERS, they are great examples of where public health measures were able to completely squash the virus and contain it to one region of the world, and it did not become a global pandemic. So obviously there are many lessons to be learned with this virus because obviously, whatever systems that we've set up globally obviously weren't good enough to contain this virus. This virus is a nasty one.
Do you think the economy has also changed a lot of global economy in that, when those viruses were around and contained, we probably didn't have that much kind of passage from those countries to our countries?
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's levels of contagion. So to start with, you have a viral pandemic, right? So you have a medical problem. And then if you don't control the medical problem, it spills over into an economic and then a social problem, right? Mm-hmm. So it's important to discuss all of those things together, but it's very important to realize that the medical problem is the root of the other two problems, your economic and social problems, right? Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't have a conversation like they're three equal problems. The medical problem, the viral problem, is the heart of the problem. And until you fix that problem, you're not going to be able to, fix your economic and social problems. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. All the conversations going on about how we get out of this situation. We're balancing lives because people die from COVID-19 and livelihoods, which is an economic issue. And we're trying to get that balance right. But the truth is, until we fix the medical problem, we're not going to be able to solve the economic or social problem.
Dan, we know that this is a virus that came from the animal kingdom. It made the jump from either a bat or a pangolin to a human in a wet market in Wuhan. What makes this virus different to other coronaviruses? How is this able to make the jump from the animal kingdom into mankind?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So coronaviruses are a large family of viruses. Lots of animals are able to carry coronaviruses, but it doesn't make those animals sick. So that's a really strange problem. A virus which makes its carrier host, it doesn't do much to that host, can make a human incredibly sick, right? And that's because we have different immune systems. So usually what happens is that viruses mutate over time. That's perfectly normal, right? The flu mutates so much that we have to make a new flu vaccine every year. That's how quickly influenza mutates. This virus mutates at a lower rate, I guess. But at some stage, it developed the properties of being able to jump into people. And this is a very unusual virus in the way it causes such a diverse range of illness in humans. So it's actually the Goldilocks set of characteristics for a disaster, right? It's completely asymptomatic. In 25, 50% of people, no symptoms at all. So they can go around and shed it and give it to other people but not be sick. But it still puts 10 to 15% of people in hospital, 5 to 10% of people in intensive care, and kills 1 to 2% of people. So it's just got that horrendous set of characteristics, which makes it incredibly contagious, but also deadly to enough people that it quickly overwhelms the health system when you unleash it in a population that has no immunity to it at all.
Can you tell us a little bit about the coronavirus community transmissions a little bit? I mean, it seems like a lot of the graphs were showing, at 90% compliance to social distancing measures, we might be able to ease back in 60 days, and at 80%, maybe 90 days, and then 70% you can't control it. What do you think we're at right now in terms of compliance? I mean, it's hard to know what everyone's doing in every suburb. Yeah. What is the understanding in the medical fraternity of how Australians are doing at this?
It's too early to know. So with the number of community transmission cases creeping up very slowly, too early to know, right? So I think what we do need to do is to get smart and use some technology to kind of look at this. And I know some companies have started to do it. For example, your iPhone, we track people's movements on freeways and things like that. And we can get a pretty good idea of people's adherence to social distancing and social isolation that way. There are some privacy issues and things that we have to be really mindful of and not give up in the process of that. The answer is I think it's too early to tell in Australia because the number of community transmissions is very low. And so we just need to wait and see whether that continues to increase at sort of a rate that will double every 8 or 9 days or whether that comes down. So it's really too early to tell.
Is wearing a mask just as good as keeping your distance from people?
There's two things I think about masks. One is kind of a sociological thing and the other one's kind of like medical and scientific. I'll deal with the medical and scientific stuff first. So scientists like to prove things, right? So they have a hypothesis, they do an experiment, they want to know. So there's some recent data that has clearly shown that if you have a mask on, obviously, the distance that you can cough out viral particles is less because it obviously hits the mask. Now, that's just basic common sense, really. One of the concerns is that when we cough, we can actually expel viral particles much further than we originally thought. It may even exceed the sort of social distancing distances that we've asked people to keep. So that is a reason. So there's building scientific evidence that wearing a mask is going to be useful, especially once you get to a stage where more people have the virus. So at the moment, we have very low numbers of transmission events, which means we have quite a low infection rate. So asking the whole population to wear a mask is probably not the most useful strategy. But if you were in New York right now where they're having a major outbreak, like lots and lots of people with the infection, then it probably is protective for people to cover their face because, their chances of spreading the virus are less. So it's also dependent on the specific context of your outbreak. That's the sort of medical answer. And I think people are doing more and more research to try and work out whether masks are actually effective. I think they will be shown to be effective. And I think it's really common sense, right? If this is a virus that comes over your face, like your nose, your mouth, when you cough, breathe, talk. And so covering it, if you are infected, probably helps to reduce transmission. But, we need to prove that with a whole bunch of experiments, which is interesting. So on a sociological level, I mentioned this in my earlier interviews, which is that in January, when the people of Hong Kong heard about the novel coronavirus in Wuhan, they just all started wearing masks. And the government didn't tell them to do that. The reason they did that is that community, that country, went through SARS. Mm-hmm. So that's a completely different situation to Australia. That is a group of people that are deeply experienced in how to deal with this problem, right? Yeah. And so from my point of view, at least in Asia, the mask is a symbol. It's a symbol that people understand the problem and know what to do. And so I talked about how people in Asia kind of have two modes, right? They have okay mode and then isolation mode. And so for them, isolation mode is the same as it is here. You stay at home, wash your hands, don't touch other people. But in Asia, they also wear a mask. And when I see the whole street full of people wearing masks, I'm like, okay, that is a country, that is a community. I'm looking at people that understand the problem and know what to do, right? So the start of this thing was that everyone was talking about what the government was doing, what, the policy was, all of this kind of stuff. And that's really important. But what's even more important is that we brought the Australian public up to speed because they had not been through this before and told them what the problem was and explained to them what the problem was and what the solution was, right? And it's always good to do something because you understand the problem and you want to be part of the solution rather than being told by the government or somebody else what to do, right? So the mask is an interesting sociological thing too. I feel like in a lot of the parts of the world, when you see someone with a mask on, they're viewed with suspicion in some way. In Asia, it's very different. If you ask someone why they're wearing a mask, it's usually because they are sick. They're like, I've got a bit of a cough or a cold, and so I'm wearing this mask to protect everyone else. In other words, it's done with good intention and with other people's best interests at heart, right?
Yep.
So I think, it's a really interesting phenomena. And I'm not saying everyone in Australia should wear a mask at the moment. It is possible if we have a big outbreak that the government will change their mind in a few months, right? Yeah. Because I think in a few months we'll have more scientific evidence about what masks do. As you know, in America, they've told everyone to put a mask on. The US CDC has changed their mind on that. So it's possible, right? And I just think that people should keep an open mind about that and realize that when you put on a mask, you're doing it to protect yourself, but also because 25 to 50% of people don't know they have the infection, they have no symptoms, you're actually protecting everyone around you when you wear the mask. So it's a two-way thing.
Yeah. So do you think that maybe the perception of masks in the Western world might change after this a little bit?
I think so. It's one of those things. Once you've worn a mask, so I've been wearing a mask for about a month, but I take the train quite a long way to work every day. I think the perception will change because it's one of those things. Once you've worn one yourself, right? Some very strange things happen to you when I wear a mask down the street, people kind of like circle around me when they walk past me. They'll like go another couple of meters away from me. I'm like, good, right? Good. Socially distancing, right? Whereas when I'm not wearing the mask, they'll walk, 1 foot from me. So I think people, once you do it yourself, then you realize why you're wearing it, then I think the way you view other people wearing one will change, right? And I don't see that as a bad thing. I think it's a really good thing.
It is a shame we might have used up most of our masks during the bushfire season, but I think there's more on the way and we're manufacturing them day by day. Dr. Dan, I want to now see if we can dispel or kind of add merit to some of the myths that have been going around. Obviously, a lot changes day to day during a pandemic. Policy definitely does, and just attitudes in general. But there were a couple of things early on that might have added to the complacency, and not just in Australia, around the world. Particularly in some more equatorial countries, there was the myth being kind of circulated that coronavirus doesn't last very well in the heat. And as well as that, there was also the myth that, your kids are all right. The kids aren't going to suffer from it. And, of course, the asymptomatic element that majority of people are going to have a mild case. What have you kind of come to learn, and where does everyone kind of stand on all that now?
We've only known about this virus for 3 months, so it takes us quite a while, right, to work out the answers to those questions, right? Mm-hmm. The first, I wouldn't call it a myth because we don't know yet, is about temperature. And I guess being a coronavirus and being a respiratory virus, it may adopt some of the characteristics of other seasonal viruses, right, like colds and flus. And it may be that once it's been around the world and been part of the endemic viral things that infect people for some time, that it may adopt a seasonal thing. But this is a very different situation. This is a completely new virus that's being let out into a community that has no immunity. So that is a devastating situation. It doesn't matter what time of year that happens. So that's not the most important priority. It may turn out much later on in 10 years' time that there is a seasonal variation, but that's not the thing that matters right now. The thing that matters right now is that no human on Earth has immunity to this virus, and therefore it'll just spread like wildfire and cause infection in everybody that it touches. So that's the first thing. The second thing you mentioned,
was age, the myth of age.
Oh, yeah, age. It is true that very young people don't appear to get that sick. Again, we have to look at the data that we have. So in the Wuhan outbreak, they had an extremely low rate of death in people under the age of 10. This is one of the reasons why the government left schools open, because there was actually no evidence that this was a serious infection in children, and it was safe to leave schools open, right? So there's no way the government would have left schools open if it wasn't safe for the children, right? Mm-hmm. So that statement is actually true. Now, here's the problem. If you let a virus out into the community, if it infects huge numbers of people, there will always be the exception to the rule, right? You're going to get, someone really young that gets really, really sick. And of course, that always makes the news, and that's the thing that scares parents, right? But on the numbers, it's true that in the vast majority of youngsters, this is a mild illness, or they don't even feel sick at all. So that statement is actually true. When we talk about young people, though, we're also talking about people in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s, and that is definitely true that we've seen a huge number of people under the age of 60, say, in intensive care and dying from COVID-19. So the original myth that this was, just like influenza, it's going to make people, grandma, grandpa in the 70s and 80s sick, that is definitely untrue. We've seen huge numbers of people in their 50s, 40s, 30s very sick from this virus. And so that's a different thing to what we're discussing regarding the children, right? And the third myth you wanted to discuss?
The asymptomatic percentages of asymptomatic, I guess you'd say, cases.
Yeah, that's a scientific question. Yeah, so that is something that you actually need to do some science, right? So you actually need to go and test people who have no symptoms. So at the start of a viral pandemic, remember, we had to make this test from scratch. Of course, you use the test to test sick people, right? So you just don't know. It wasn't until they did some bigger studies. The classic study was the one in Iceland, because the whole population lived around the capital Reykjavik, that they were able to sequence just a whole lot of completely well people. And then they were like, oh my goodness, half the people who tested positive had no symptoms at all. That's crazy for a virus like this, right? So that's a scientific question. And so I guess, there's a lot of assumptions. So at the start of this thing, people were making a lot of assumptions, and I guess that's where the myth-making comes from. But it always takes science a little time to answer those questions properly.
And aren't we glad we've got you there?
There's just one thing I want to talk about: age.
Yeah.
I read this morning that the biggest age demographic that has COVID-19 are girls aged between 20 and 29.
That is correct.
In Australia?
Yeah, and that was also true of other analyses of
girls
other outbreaks
gross.
in different countries.
Gross.
I'm not going there. I'm not going there. So we knew that we had to talk to young people in this particular pandemic, right? And it's not about blame. It's the fact that when you're in your 20s, you're doing a lot of things where you're incredibly social. You hug and you kiss a lot of friends. You probably share a beer. You do a lot of things where there's direct and indirect contact between people. You go out and party, you go listen to your favorite DJ, things like that.
And you do those things overseas.
With huge numbers of people. Yeah, exactly. And you travel. And so that particular age group, just because of how social they are, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I meant. It's such a strange situation to explain to people that, you live your life a particular way, and then now we're telling you, just by doing that, just by going out of your home and doing what you normally do, is now deadly to many, many other people. It is a deeply distressing and disturbing thing to explain to people. And so, but it's very important that we talk to young people properly and in a way that, it's not about blame, but it's about explaining a very, very peculiar situation that we've never been through in living memory, and explaining why we have to change our behavior. Otherwise, many, many other people will get sick. And, if you're in your 20s, the chances that you would fall very sick from COVID-19 are extremely low, right? But that's what I mean. It's not about the individual person. It's about what happens to the rest of society. And I find it incredibly easy to explain to people, because you just talk to them about their parents and their grandparents and parents and grandparents of their friends. And once they realize that their behavior potentially put at risk the health of other people that they love, it becomes very easy to change your behaviour, actually, because you're highly motivated to do so.
Personally, I blame Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City for the spike in young girls aged 25 to 29. They've all flown back here from Brooklyn and they're hiding at mum and dad's, potentially spreading COVID.
And they're just coughing on people, aren't they?
As long as
they're coughing on each other.
Exactly.
Now, there's one question I do want to ask because we're going to see a lot more of this in the news. And this might draw on maybe some medical disciplines that you haven't really kind of specialised in your career. But just in your opinion, with these cruise ships, we've seen basically what's happened is what they can say in these investigations, particularly in the Ruby Princess, what they can say is there was a mistake that was made, messages got mixed up, and a boat full of COVID-19 infected boomers unloaded in Circular Quay. Now, who knows really what you're meant to do in that circumstance? What do you think, is there a playbook for this when we do have something like that sitting in Sydney Harbour or in the mouth of Brisbane? Like, what is the play? Do you send medical crews on? Surely this has happened before with some form of kind of contagious illness.
So the answer to your question is I don't know, right? As far as I'm aware, with the SARS and MERS outbreak, the most similar recent thing, we didn't have this cruise ship problem. So the answer is we didn't have a pre-prepared playbook, right, to work on this problem. But I'm sure that we will develop one now, right? So we always say, so everything's so easy in retrospect. It's so easy to be really critical of everybody, right? When something happens, when a mistake is made or something. But the truth is that it was a completely unprecedented situation, and there were just so many unknowns. There were so many things we didn't know, and everything was moving so quickly. So these pandemics move so quickly. So I always say it's very easy to be critical, but that's not the important point. The important point is to fix the problem. So, we had that problem, but the mistakes, then we knew we had a cruise ship problem. And so we've really dealt with every other cruise ship very differently, right? And so we haven't had a repeat of the problem. The medical lesson was learned very quickly. The second element to the thing is, can we do it better? Definitely. And I'm sure, in the fallout of the investigation, that there'll be a whole bunch of recommendations which will be adopted. The country to look to, I think, is Singapore, which is a country which is very small, and they've been through several kind of viral things before. They have an incredibly well-prepared system, have a national plan. The government there's a whole hospital just for pandemics. So I think in the wake of this, we're going to need to review all of those things that will happen at the right level of government with all the relevant experts advising, and we'll be much better prepared the next time.
Good to know.
Good there. That is good to know. It's like any disaster in Australia, though. We need a big one before we have a playbook. We went from globally now. I'm talking first 3 months since this virus first came into existence to get to 500,000 cases worldwide. From there, it took 8 days to get to 1 million. Now it looks like it's going to double from there in less than 8 days. So it looks like it's going to go from 1 million to 2 million in less than 8 days. That is now moving, obviously, 200% faster each week. Where do you think are going to be the biggest hotspots worldwide? Where do you think?
Yeah. So the numbers that you're reporting, it's just the classic numbers for a global pandemic, right?
Yeah.
But you're also seeing a few things. Firstly, there are just more cases. The virus is spreading. But every country is increasing its capacity to test, right?
Yeah.
So as you test more, you're going to pick up more cases, right?
Okay.
So with numbers, you can follow the numbers, but what's even more important than numbers sometimes is experience, right? And so the experience of every country so far is that around 2 weeks after you enforce a hard lockdown, the curve really starts to flatten, right? So it takes about 2 weeks to do that. So a huge proportion of the world, more than half the world, is in some kind of lockdown at the moment. And so hopefully by doing that, by countries taking a proactive stance with lockdowns, we can minimize the number of global deaths in this first upswing, right? So hopefully we start to see that global curve level off. But one of the reasons why it won't is because we're doing so many more tests. So we're just going to pick up more cases, right? So that's the way that's going to go. There is literally no other way at the moment to control this problem other than to enforce some kind of lockdown. And the lockdown is really just enforced social isolation, right? So social isolation, the thing we've been discussing, keeping away from other people, is the answer. I was talking about people's personal responsibility to do that and understanding the problem and doing it yourself. but lockdowns are sort of government enforced, okay? Your social circumstances partly determine whether you are able to socially isolate. And there's been a really great conversation talking, how lucky we are in Australia about how much space we each have, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, some parts of the world, particularly the extreme opposite, the places in India where people live in huge, huge slums, right? Mm-hmm. They cannot wash their hands. They cannot socially distance themselves. It's just not physically possible. Mm-hmm. And so social isolation is a privilege, right? We have the ability to do it, and we should be grateful for that. So I think what you'll see is that this was a disease that started in China. Then we saw South Korea and Iran have outbreaks, and then now the sort of northern Western hemisphere. The next hotspots will be the developing world, right? Mm-hmm. Indonesia, India, Brazil. And these are countries with very densely packed populations, very poor healthcare systems. Yeah, so that's the ones that we are really fearful that we will see huge loss of life. And we won't even they don't have the capacity to test, right? So we'll never know the true toll of lives in this pandemic because there are some places that just won't be able to test. So that's definitely the next thing that we're looking at. We're reasonably confident that Europe has its problem under control in that most of Europe is in lockdown. And so it's just a matter of time before those cases level off. So we see that happening in Spain, Italy, in terms of cases and deaths. America still doesn't have a national lockdown, right? They're doing it state by state. And so you'll see that problem evolve. So you'll go from New York, and then there's a huge problem brewing in Detroit and New Orleans. So that country's problem will be spread out over many months, but you'll see a rolling series of catastrophes across different cities. So I think, we'll see it play out very differently in different countries, cities, and regions. And the dominant question in a viral pandemic is when the government locked down, right? The earlier you lock down, look at Australia, right? Look at New Zealand. New Zealand was way ahead of the curve, right? And they're going to do great. So they are one of the few countries that could possibly eradicate this virus by lockdown and testing because they locked down at such an early stage. It's possible, right? Yeah. If New Zealand is able to do that, and I'm not saying that they will be able to, but if they could do it, they could do something remarkable, which is that if they really get their cases to zero, they could reopen the domestic economy. Everyone could go back to normal life. But the international borders stay closed, and they could basically live normal lives, right? Whilst the rest of the world is in this kind of half lockdown, you're releasing the brake, putting the brake on, releasing the brake, situation until a vaccine is found. So full kudos to Jacinda Ardern in having the foresight and the leadership to lock down hard really early. I really hope that they're able to do it, and that would be an incredible model to look at in terms of how we deal with future pandemics.
So we'll ask you one more question, then we'll let you get back to your very important work. Is the only real pathway back to life as we knew it in the time before the coronavirus, is the only way back there basically through a vaccine then?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So the vaccine is by far and away the most likely way out of this quagmire, right?
Yep.
The really senior people at CSL and Johnson & Johnson have said it's a minimum of 12 months away, and that's if everything goes right? I'm sure with, complete global effort, we can push that time frame even a little bit faster. But, we're talking about that time frame, which is a really long time, right? So the other way is to attempt to let the virus out a little bit at a time, what we call developing community herd immunity. But the problem with this virus, as I discussed, is that if you're not immune to it, it still has that set of characteristics. It's fine in some people, it makes some people really sick, puts them in hospital and then intensive care. So it's a really difficult alternative, right? If you can't get rid of the virus in the way that I described with New Zealand, completely squashing it, eradicating it, then we're really waiting for a vaccine. There is one other way out, which is if they find an antiviral agent that stops people from getting very sick. In other words, you catch the virus fine, you have a fever, you get tested, and you're not feeling well. If we can find an antiviral agent or something that stops you from getting very sick, in other words, we don't cause a massive crush of intensive care beds, that would also be an acceptable way out in that you could let the virus spread into the community, but be able to treat the group of people who are sick and prevent them from ending up in ICU, right? But, we don't have an agent like that yet, but that is the other way out other than a vaccine.
Right. So you don't think we're having that conversation in Australia that sounds like New Zealand are working towards You don't think that Australia, we've got a few interesting weeks to get through, namely this Easter weekend, but you don't think that we'll be having that conversation about potentially resolving this through lockdowns and testing?
So I think a lot of people, experts in epidemiology, have, discussed the different ways out, and, a complete squashing of the virus, total eradication from the continent is possible, but it's very difficult, and the chances of success are unknown, right? So it's like, I guess the way I think about it is like when they decided to go to the moon, right, put people on the moon, they didn't know that it was possible or that the mission would be a success, but they decided to do it. It's a little bit like that. The conversation is definitely happening, right, amongst epidemiologists and those experts about whether it's possible in Australia. So Australia has two things going for it. It's an island continent, and so we have total control of our borders. That is key. Number two, we have a low rate of infection at the moment, right? We don't look like Spain, Italy, or New York, but it's very difficult. We have a very large country, and so the problem with the process of eradication is that you really can't get it wrong. You can't miss any cases, because if you do it, if you go a hard lockdown, that has an incredible cost associated with it. And, you do a heap of testing, you roll out community testing. Now, when you take everything off, if you missed, a number of cases, and then the virus spreads again, then you've gone through all of that. You're going to have to lock down again at some stage, and you've gone through that whole process with all of the costs. And it didn't work, right? So it's like the moon landing. It's possible that, a disaster happened. It's possible that, they didn't make it there. So it's a really, really deeply complex conversation. But we are having it. People are literally modeling and working through, is it possible to eradicate this virus from Australia? But I guess the government probably came to the view that it's unlikely, which is why they've kind of come out with this 6-month package. They think the most likely way through probably is that we're just going to have to sit tight for a vaccine. I think that's what's going on, but the conversation is definitely happening amongst people who know what they're talking about.
Well, Dr. Dan, you've instilled a lot of confidence, I guess, in both Errol and I, but also you've shared a lot of information that I just don't think has been that accessible over the last few months, last few scary months, may I add. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Dan, and we look forward to reading more of your stuff and seeing more of you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
No problem. Cheers.